a privilege for me to be asked to chair this session. And it's a particular privilege. I know many people have talked about Comrade P. Sundarayya this morning, and people who are much more distinguished and eminent and worthy of talking about him. I have to say that as a young woman, it was the writings of people like Comrade Sundarayya that actually made me feel interested in the left. His recognition of the rights of women, his recognition of the relationship between the economy, the nature of political violence, the way it is used as a tool of subjugation, particularly for women, and the uses of that treatment of women for capitalism, for feudalism, and then capitalism. I think these were all very impressive insights for all of us. And of course, the vision he had for a just society in which both men and women are freed from these shackles of gender oppression is something that we all still cherish. So it is a particular honor, I think, to be able to talk in a session like this on women in the economy and society. I think a lot of discussion already occurred in the morning on some of these issues. So I don't want to sound simplistic, but I just want to relate some of that morning discussion to what we are, I think, going to address in the afternoon. Particularly, I think I would like to look at the way capitalism, or the capitalist processes in India in particular, have utilized the subordinate status of women and how necessary that has been for the kind of economic expansion that we have experienced, how the accumulation process in India, particularly over the last 20 years, has been so deeply dependent on these social distinctions. Of course, the gender distinction, but also others of caste and of religion and various other distinctions, how capitalism has used these very effectively to ensure a particular kind of economic expansion. I want to just begin by highlighting that there is often this thing about how much work women do. In other words, what is the nature of women's work under capitalism, and when does work participation increase and when does it come down, and so on. In fact, women have always been workers under capitalism. There really isn't a non-working woman. It's a question of whether that woman is recognized, paid for the work, and so on. But also, I think it's the fact of this distinction, the fact of this difference between men and women that has been created particularly with respect to what is recognized work is very important for capitalism in at least 4 different ways. First, of course, it means that you have a wonderful flexibility in terms of the labor supply. One of the many myths about capitalism is that labor supply is fixed, and that within that labor supply you can change the participation rate and so on. That's nonsense, because in fact global capitalism has always managed to change the labor supply to suit itself through migration, through the use of child labor, and particularly through the use of women. So women get drawn into what is the recognized or paid labor force in particular periods and thrown out of it again and go back to pure unpaid social reproduction in other periods as per the requirements of capitalism. The second is, of course, the fact that because of this and because of the huge role paid by unpaid labor, there is a dramatic subsidization, shall I say, of the wages that have to be paid under capitalism. In other words, it is the unpaid labor performed by women that allows capitalism or employers in general to actually pay much lower wages to male heads of household, because of the implicit assumption that a whole range of costs of living, that is to say the costs of social reproduction, will be taken care of by the unpaid labor of mostly women in their households. But the third has to do with what flexibility the fact of women as paid workers provides capitalism. And that's very important, because we are finding that the many ways in which women can be drawn into the paid workforce have played a huge role in giving capitalism flexibility in terms of costs, in terms of hiring and firing, in terms of ensuring that they can meet certain demands for exports and so on in a very particular way. Now, I believe all of this is very much part of the recent capitalist trajectory in particular, the nature of we've had a very, very peculiar accumulation process in India. As you know, it's already been highlighted in the morning by many speakers, the fact that we've had relatively high rates of aggregate income growth with hardly any increase in no increase in formal sector employment, hardly any increase in even informal employment, very terrible conditions of living, declining nutrition indicators, etc., etc. This combination is hard to understand unless we look at the specific type of capitalism that we have generated. I think it's historically unique. I don't think we've seen this particular trajectory anywhere else. And it is because Indian capitalism can take advantage of these many existing systems of hierarchy. I do believe that in India we are maybe the world leaders in hierarchy and discrimination. We have the most forms of it, the most proliferation of it, and the most deeply entrenched ways of ensuring discrimination, exclusion, oppression. So capitalism is able to use these in ways that actually create segmented labor markets, allow for some activities to be performed much cheaper, ensure that wages do not rise above a point, but that in turn has a perverse effect. That effect then means that capitalism is less interested in generating what might be called relative surplus value increases. That is to say, it's less interested in productivity increases, in technological progress that would, rely on higher productivity across the board. And it is quite happy with existing in an economy where the profits are to be had from various forms of generation of what Marx called absolute surplus value, including from the paid and unpaid labor of women, but also from the undervaluing of things like land which is expropriated and so on and so forth. Okay, this is just the background. Let me talk a little bit about the nature of women's work in India, which I think is just a sort of beginnings to understand the rest of the discussion, which will deal with how the government has approached women and the nature of violence against women, the political economy of that. In India we have a very strange combination of forces that is occurring in the last 2 decades. And it's reflected broadly as follows. Compared to most economies in Asia, and particularly economies that are growing very rapidly and are seen as emerging and in high growth phase and all of that, we have relatively low official work participation rates of women, or recognized work of women. And not only is it low, but the overall trend over the last 2 decades is of decline, of a slight decline, not a huge decline, but nonetheless a decline. There is a slight blimp upwards in 2004-05, which is mainly women self-employed in agriculture. But the overall trend from the early 1990s is of declining workforce participation rates of women. Now, this is unusual. In fact, it is almost unique because most economies, especially Asian economies that have been growing very rapidly, that are export-oriented, that are globalizing, and that show dramatically high rates of accumulation, most such economies show very sharp increases in women's work participation. China, of course, but the entire range of all the Southeast Asian economies in our neighborhood, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, all of them show not just high but increasing female workforce participation rates. And here we have, on average, low and declining. Now, of course, this varies a lot across states. In Andhra Pradesh, it's not that the case. In Andhra Pradesh, it's very high relative to the rest of India, high workforce participation, especially in the rural areas. But even in Andhra Pradesh, we will find a decline in the trend of this. It doesn't make sense at one level, what's going on. But let me first highlight this as one trend. In a sense, the decline in paid employment or recognized employment. The second trend is what I would call an increase in underpaid employment. Now, I know that's a very terrible term, and of course it's conceptually flawed and so on, but let me define it broadly as follows. It is payment at work which is not just below the legal minimum wages, but is below the market wage for such activities. Okay? So a significant increase in underpaid work, specifically of women. And this is led, amazingly enough, by government employment, by public employment, which is the leader in the underpaid work of women through things that Smita will discuss more, things like the schemes like Anganwadi, where the Anganwadi workers and helpers get an honorarium, not a wage, where the Ashas are given this pittance amount, again as an honorarium, by the parallel teachers in education centers, not schools, and so on and so forth. There are a huge range of public services provided through the underpaid labor of women. The third feature that we have is a significant increase in the unpaid labor of women. Now, this is important, and I want to highlight this a little bit more, because despite the fact that people mention it now and then, I don't think we fully absorb how important it is, how essential this is for all capitalist activities, and how our economy would grind to a halt without this unpaid labor. People think of unpaid labor essentially in terms of the care work, housework, looking after children, looking after the old people, looking after sick people, things that families do internally. Yes, it is that, and that is a very significant part of it. But there is a lot of unpaid labor in India that is also what is otherwise called purely material activity, in terms of the collection of fuel wood, which takes up huge amounts of time for many rural women, of the collection of water, which is for both urban and women now a major time-consuming activity, of a range of other processing, of a range of home-based dairy, livestock, etc., gardening, kitchen gardening, a huge range of these activities, which approximately 2/3 of Indian women are engaged in on a regular basis, but which is not recognized. Now, the fact that this is unpaid is critical in ensuring the survival of households at what would be otherwise below subsistence wages. And it is the ability of capitalism to rely on that system of unpaid labor that means they don't have to increase wages. Because, it will fall below subsistence means you will lose, in a sense, the predator will lose the prey. So you have to actually ensure that they get that minimum. We've experienced, why do I say we've experienced an increase in unpaid labor? Because I could just say that there is unpaid labor, and that it has stayed, approximately the same. What about it has led to an increase? It has increased essentially because of the failure of the state to meet public demand for essential social services. That is to say, whether it is in the sanitation or in health or in basic infrastructure. You have to go and collect fuel wood, and now you have to go further and further. It's a complicated system. First of all, you have to go and collect fuel wood because you do not have access to any kind of, let's say, piped fuel anywhere near your habitation. But the fuel that you could have collected is now harder to collect, and you have to travel longer distances because forestation schemes mean that you cannot just go to the nearby forest. Large tracts of area are sealed off, so you have to go to longer and longer distances. This is certainly true, I know, in Andhra Pradesh also. So that in fact you are adding to the unpaid labor of women just by in this one particular activity. The increasing difficulty in collecting water. Sainath will be here tomorrow, but recently he's had a number of pieces which have just told you about the time it takes to collect water. How many hours per day are spent in this desperate search to generate 2 buckets of water to meet the basic needs of a household. That has significantly increased, particularly in the last decade. A huge range of public services are also effectively passed on to the unpaid labor of women because the state doesn't meet them or it cuts back on this essential provision. If there is not a public health facility that will arrange for looking after a patient, somebody has to nurse that patient. If there is not facility to look after young children, someone will have to look after those children. When people fall old and are no longer able to look after themselves, somebody has to look after themselves. In the absence of social provision or the cutting down of social provision or the privatizing of these services, which makes them more expensive, it has to be performed within the household, which means women are the ones who are ending up doing it. And in fact, many time-use surveys, which are now being conducted in many states of the country, are finding that this unpaid labor is actually increasing. The time spent in a lot of these activities is increasing, not decreasing, in the 8 states in which this survey was conducted. And the fourth thing, which will sound contradictory in the middle of all this, I'm telling you that in a sense, paid employment is not increasing except in certain peculiar ways. Unpaid employment is increasing, underpaid employment is the order of the day, but also open unemployment is increasing. Now this is very strange, because remember, in India we have no unemployment benefit, we have no unemployment insurance, and even if we do, in the few states where there is a little bit, there is no question of women getting it. Young women in particular, no question of women accessing any of this. Nonetheless, we find very, very high rates of open unemployment. In fact, the latest NSS survey tells us that young urban women between the ages of 19 to 24, the unemployment rate is as high as 26% for the daily rate, which is an amazingly high rate of open unemployment. That means actively looking for but not finding work. Now, this peculiar combination is really a result of the trajectory of capitalism that has been followed overall in this country, and it is something which is not an accident. So it seems like it is an unlikely and peculiar combination, but in fact it is very much a reflection of this type of capitalism, and I would go further to argue that it is in fact a result of the fact that our accumulation process is dependent on this feature of gender relations and being able to use women in this peculiar way. Let me just hark back to the paid labor, because I think that will illustrate precisely what I mean. When we look at the paid labor of women, there are certain kinds of labor that have increased. There is the labor which is part-time in government services, and a lot of that is precisely what I mentioned to you: Anganwadi workers, helpers, ad hoc activities, etc., etc. There is this self-employment in manufacturing in both rural and urban areas. Now you will ask me, in manufacturing, how much self-employment can there be, especially for women? A large part of this is not really self-employment. A large part of this is because these are women at the bottom of production chains that are often very, very complex and go right up to multinational production. So that you actually have women either in their own homes or in small, very cottage enterprises who are doing things that will feed into a broader production structure, sometimes leading to the local market, sometimes to a national market, and sometimes to a multinational market. So, for example, even in the city of Delhi, there is a place called Kusumpur Pahari, where there are women whom you will find in their homes, in the Jhuggi cluster. They are assembling electric irons, which will then be sold in the market. With no assistance, with no training, with no safety precautions, they are assembling electric irons. They are stuffing up quilts. They are doing all kinds of activities. But they are also dipping shoelaces for Nike shoes. They are also sewing sequins onto what will become Benetton t-shirts, sold for export. So they are doing piece rate work for not even a minimum wage, because for some of these activities the wages were unbelievable. They were 7 rupees a day, 10 rupees a day was the net income, because these are piece rate activities. Not even half a liter of milk could be bought with their daily earnings. But this is the new kind of increase in self-employment in manufacturing. In rural India, a large part of the increase in self-employment in manufacturing was that which was led by a lot of self-help groups that encouraged women to get into things like food processing, biscuit making, achar, pickle, papad, etc. Many of which have become unviable. There are very few states in Kerala. In fact, the Kutumbashree model is viable, but in most other states, these self-help group economic activities are not viable. Nonetheless, women engage in it as a desperate attempt to add some little amount to the family income. And then there is the biggest increase in employment of all. You will ask me, what is that category? Okay, so we are a dynamic, giant, emerging economy, we are export driven, we are all of these things, and there is an increase in regular employment. 4 million increase in regular employment. No, sorry, 2.8 million increase in urban regular employment. So that's a very good thing, right? That's a sign that we are getting better. No, because 60% of that increase is in domestic service. The biggest increase in women's regular employment in India, in both urban and rural India, over the last decade, is in domestic service. This is not a sign of economic dynamism. It is a sign of greater differentiation and greater desperation of women who find that they have to do something to actually increase their the household's income in whatever way is possible. Okay, now it is precisely because of all this that capitalism in India has been able to operate, as it were, on the cheap. That is to say, we have got an accumulation process that has taken for granted very, very cheap labor and has taken for granted a range of extra economic, social and other forces that will allow it to maintain these segmented labor markets, which is why there is little incentive to engage in aggregate productivity enhancing kinds of activities. So we also have therefore a relatively lazy capitalist class. Quite apart from all its other features, it's a capitalist class that has got used to handouts from the state, whether in the form of cheap land or tax relief or cheap electricity or etc., or takeover of existing assets at throwaway prices, or the ability to use existing patterns of social discrimination, including gender but also caste, etc. It is a capitalist class, therefore, that is incapable of fulfilling its own potential, if you like, of technology enhancing, productivity improving, accumulation. So this is the broad trajectory in which we have to situate women's work in India. And I think it allows us to understand why it is that despite this period of very, very dramatic growth, we see no increase in the real wages of most women workers. We see a deterioration in the economic conditions and the working conditions of most of these workers. And we see a dramatic increase in the fragility and precarious nature of such work. Let me stop here. And so Smita Gupta is going to talk about women and the state.
Thank you, comrades, for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity. I think as a tribute and a mark of respect to Comrade Sundarayya, what I'm going to do is to raise issues relating to public policy and government policy in relation to the left and democratic women's movement over the past 2 or 3 decades, the kind of demands we've been raising around women's issues and the response of the state to these. These are issues on which ADWA as well as other women's organizations have been active. And I'll start with the issue that Jyoti spoke about first, which is the question of employment. She has already pointed out to you the current situation as far as women's work is concerned, of which the 2 most important features are that women are paid very little, work is very insecure. In addition to this, the employers are often very invisible. So demands for any kind of social security, for wages, for security of work, have to be made to invisible employers in a chain of subcontracting where we don't know who they are. And therefore, a lot of our struggles are vis-a-vis the state really, because then we demand of the state. And one such opportunity was provided by the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, where the potential for generating a huge wage employment based growth program actually, because through giving purchasing power to people, through the multiplier effect, you could have employment-led growth. But the experience has been very sorry on this program. As most of you will know, the days of work generated is very low. Even though women have a special provision and they are getting work under this, nonetheless, it is at well below the minimum wages because it is once again piece-rated work. So women's work on government work sites is exploited by the same mechanism of piece rating, of not taking into account a lot of activities which they do, and by imposing back-breaking manual work, which is often not possible for a lot of the women given the age profile of the workers, with the result that you find a lot of children and young girls at work sites. So the NREGA was an important opportunity which has been missed. The second issue which I want to go to is the question of natural resources. Because today, women by and large have always taken the responsibility of supplementing household sustenance and agriculture through the collection and management of natural resources. Today, in the neoliberal phase of capitalism, what do we find? We find a growing tendency not only towards annexation, but also larger and larger tracts getting degraded through mining, through deforestation, through diversion for all kinds of large infrastructure projects which don't benefit the poor, but which are at the cost of the resources of the poor. Now, these dual processes of annexation through primitive accumulation and degradation through all kinds of economic activities which are destroying the environment have a disproportionate impact on women in their role as collectors of common property resources, which is becoming more and more difficult for them. Added to this is the question of land acquisition and displacement, because once again, it's not just a question of being denied access to common property. It's also being displaced from traditional work, from areas they live in, from occupations they've been doing, through a hugely increased pressure on the land and the resources of the poor through land acquisition policies of the state for SEZs, for industrial corridors and the like. Here again, the rights of women and the responsibilities of women are both violated heavily. Agriculture is another sector on which we have been having a lot of struggles. In fact, we wrote a note on this to the ministry where we said, you see, today you see that a lot of households are female-headed, and agricultural households, women who are reporting themselves as cultivators and as heads of households, especially in the hilly and dry lands of this country, has grown immensely. These are also the areas which have suffered the most from neglect. The state has withdrawn from agriculture in general, and more so from the backward regions, from the dry lands. These are the regions where women are increasingly taking decisions and running family plots. So the low productivity, which was in any case a problem in these areas because of historic neglect, has got compounded by neoliberal policies of not giving inputs, not providing irrigation, not undertaking land and soil management through public investment, and not procuring the crops which are produced in these areas. So the role of women as cultivators is something which we as in ADWA have been trying to raise for a long time, and that's a very, very important part of this current conjuncture. The government has a scheme called the Mahila Kisan Shaktikaran Pariyojana. But like most of these add-on schemes, which are added on to other programs, the allocations are very low, the reach is very limited, and it really becomes a formality rather than anything effective. The larger programs like RKVY, etc., do not have a special component or any attention to addressing the needs of women cultivators. Another issue which Jayati had taken up is the whole question of public services. The other thing we find is that increasingly the state is shifting its responsibility, whether it is water, sanitation, health, education, nutrition, street lighting, which is very, very important for women, lighting of homes, or public security, public transport. These are all issues which concern women all the time. These are areas from which the state is increasingly moving towards a PPP model, a privatization model which is based on extracting user charges or insurance policies, both of which means a much greater role for the private sector and a much greater increase in prices and lower access. And this is particularly shocking given the poor performance in many indicators: child sex ratio, health attainments of other kinds, anemia. 56% of women are anemic in this country. So, these are all well known, so I'm not going to dwell on the data. But another issue is the whole question of public services and the public provisioning of these public services. Another issue which we've been raising in recent times is the question of pensions. As you know, women tend to outlive men, and even though on the average the sex ratio is adverse to women in this country, if you take the 60 plus age group, there are actually 1030 women per 1,000 men. So there are far more older women than there are men, and yet for all older people the policies about pension are awful. By and large, the central government gives 200 rupees if you're 60 plus, which goes up to 500 if you're 80 plus. Some states have supplemented this, but even then, states like Goa and Delhi give 1,000 rupees. That's the maximum. I think in Andhra Pradesh it's still 200 or 300. 200. This is only to BPL households, and the age is 60. Now, we have been demanding for a long time that this age limit should be brought down, should be 50 for women and 55 for men. The pension should be 2,000 rupees, and it should be for everybody except for those who have been in government employment and are receiving pension from their previous status as employees. So the issue of pension and a non-contributory pension is something which again is a very, very important part of the women's movement, but it is something which is universally applicable like most other issues. The other issue to which I want to draw your attention is the whole question of single women. Single women actually constitute a very large number in our country. The 2001 census put them at 7.4% of all adult women. And now this is 11% of all Indian households which are female headed. And by the way, the definition of single women which is used is very restrictive. It's basically widows widows and divorcees, not abandoned, widows and divorcees. So women who are abandoned, women who are unmarried, and several other customarily separated women are not included in this definition. So if you actually do that, the number of vulnerable women who are single, who may be hidden within joint kitchens in extremely exploitative and oppressive conditions, where caste, community, and all kinds of other factors would exploit them in all possible ways, they remain totally outside the reach of government programs. Even where they may be eligible, they actually have no access to them. So our demand has been that this so-called widow pension should be extended to all single women. It should again be increased. And in many states, ages vary. I don't know what it's here, but it's 50 in some states, 55 in others. But in Rajasthan, in a recent survey, people found that girls below 18 who had been married off at 12, 13 were widowed. There were many girls, but they were not eligible. So they were being sexually exploited by the upper castes in that village. Therefore, the whole question of single women and other vulnerable sections is again a question which we have been taking up for a long time. Women in government programs. Jayati had talked about that too. This is the most shocking and most noteworthy trend, I think, in the last 10-15 years, where in the name of calling these women honorary community activists, their work is not given the status of work, their wages are treated as an honorarium, they're underpaid, they have no rights, and yet they're expected to deliver all benefits under the ICDS, under the health missions, increasingly as para-teachers under the teaching programs. C2 has been organizing these women. We've had a huge rally about, I think, 2 or 3 months ago in Delhi. Under pressure, the government did make some announcements in the budget, but that's too little. It's just too little. The demand is minimum wages. They have to be paid minimum wages. They have to be recognized as workers, and they have to be given security of tenure. But increasingly, in government programs, we've seen this for 30 years, 40 years. You have famine relief programs, you have drought relief programs, and you find women are underpaid because of piece-rated work. But now, as government employees who are not recognized as such, they are given a pittance as a wage and are expected to deliver much of the public services. Whereas this is a huge opportunity not only for employment generation, but also to give public services to the people. So a demand of the state has been to actually provide public services through decent work and decent employment of these women on these programs. The question of food security and price rise is something which we've been taking up for a very long time. And it is really shocking that we have such a huge, I think almost 3 times the norm as buffer. We are willing to give 4 to 5 lakh crores every year as tax concessions. So we have the grain, we have the money, we have both. And yet the government is still insisting on a targeted food security system under the new bill. They have tabled some amendments yesterday, but they have not addressed this core issue of targeting. They're going to reduce the entitlements. They're not going to give it to everybody. And therefore the problem of exclusion at a time when a vast majority of our people face malnutrition and hunger, where we are home to 1/4 of the world's hungry, is really quite shocking, because you have the grain, you have the money, you have a slack in agriculture. If you put your act together, you can actually increase production and productivity in the medium and long run. But it's just a political unwillingness to provide that food security or to control price rise. We have the worst performance in all BRICS countries, and in the case of food, the increase in retail prices has been, I think, 12 to 13%, and wholesale prices around 11.5 or so. And yet, we have absolutely no problem in increasing diesel and oil prices after deregulation. We have done it repeatedly since we have deregulated. We go on the center goes on collecting taxes, I think 80,000 crores at the last count, which could have easily been transferred as a lower price to, especially for diesel and petrol, for transportation of essential commodities, but that has not been done. Or the issue of futures trading in agricultural commodities, where there was a cross-party consensus in the standing committee, and yet this government has not only encouraged it, but it has actually increased. I have some data. In the discussion of this time, we can go into that. But the point that I'm trying to make is that instead of trying to have a universal food system and controlling prices, this government is still hell-bent on neither controlling inflation nor providing food security to everybody. In fact, now under a lot of pressure, they're liquidating these stocks and exporting them. And they're actually exporting them at a higher price than what they've paid the farmer, but at a lower price than what consumers pay for it through the PDS. So it's a price which is beneficial only to traders. Farmers could not benefit from it through the minimum support price, and consumers could not benefit from it through lower prices in the PDS or its distribution in the PDS. So this pressure to actually export these stocks is growing, and the government has already done, I think, 3 or 4 rounds of this kind of liquidation. And what are they offering us instead is a series of targeted approaches. These targeted approaches through gender budgeting. They're going to be audited through gender budgeting. So we're all going to be caught looking at these departmental sheets which they give us about how much is being spent on women through targeted programs. And the other panacea for everything is the direct benefit transfer and cash schemes linked through the really dubious Aadhaar platform, where we are all going to get, where people, the poor, the BPL households are going to get the subsidy element through the really dubious Aadhaar program. What have we been demanding? This is to sum up finally what is the macroeconomic policy approach that we at AIDWA have been trying to put through our work and through our struggles. The targeted approaches towards women, we have no problem if special provisions are made for women. They need to be made, whether through employment or through social security measures and so on. But unless the overall macroeconomic policy framework is conducive to providing universal, accessible and cheap economic and social services to everybody, there is no way that women are going to be able to get it. More so if you have perverse policies that actually undermine the well-being of women or undermine the targeted programs. So on the one hand, you have a program to regenerate the green cover in a village. On the other hand, you take away all the common property and give it to an industrialist who's going to contaminate your water resources. Or you have contractionary macroeconomic and fiscal policies where you actually cut spending, cut subsidies, look upon all kinds of benefits which are given to the poor as waste, especially when it comes to provisioning of goods. You only want to give cash. You don't want to give the service, you don't want to give the goods, you don't want to provide directly any of the benefits, and then you want to transfer cash to make people dependent on a private system which is uneven, which will only follow the profit and not the need. So in the backward areas, in the remote areas, you're never going to find these private people there unless there's a huge subsidy given to them. So unless the overall macroeconomic policy framework is actually conducive to an employment-based, huge wage-generating program where you have asset creation, where you have public service creation, where you provide special interventions for women, children, but the entire population in a universal and holistic framework, the struggle for women's rights is going to be incomplete, and public policy through targeting is something which we have to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Smita. It's my pleasure now to invite Dr. Kalyani Menon Sen, who will talk on the political economy of violence against women.
Thank you, Jyoti. And let me start by saying how honored I feel to be here, to be invited to speak at this event, to be in the company of Jyoti and Smita, but also to be speaking to so many people whose thoughts, whose writings have really framed my own political growth and my own understanding. So thank you again very much for inviting me. I live and work in Delhi, and all of us who've been in Delhi, as indeed all of us in the country, the last few months have been dominated by the violent act against a young physiotherapist student in Delhi last winter, and by a series of continuing gruesome acts of violence against women and children. In one way, it's surprising that so much of public feeling, very welcome media attention and very welcome public outrage has been triggered by these actions, because actually they are neither the only such actions, they are not the most gruesome, they are not the most condemnable. This is a trend that has been going on at least for the last decade and a half, and to which as a public, as a society, we seem to have become quite anesthetized. So somehow the fact that this explosion of protest happened in Delhi, regardless of its very complicated political underpinnings, is welcome in as much as it's made us open our mouths, it's made us open our eyes and recognize the ubiquity of violence against women. But of course, one major problem remains, that the conversation around violence continues to be around acts like rape, public assault, sexual harassment on the streets, and child abuse by strangers, and so on and so on. The fact that there are many, many more kinds of violence against women, many, many more crimes against women, which are not classified as crimes against women. For example, custodial assault, assault by the army, the military, by various empowered organs of the state, dispossession and violence against women in pursuit of property cases, forms of violence against Dalit women and Adivasi women. These kinds of violence seem to have been left out of the conversation. Somehow the silence surrounding this violence is not, has not been broken, despite the fact that we now have Vikram Pandit and Mukesh Ambani and Cyrus Mistry and various distinguished gentlemen of that ilk commenting and expressing their horror at such violence, and also suggesting all kinds of things to the state. And these suggestions range from karate classes to pepper sprays to IT-enabled undershirts where you can, you know, if somebody assaults you, you press a button and a bell rings in the police station, etc., etc. It is a new phenomenon that we are seeing so much of corporate vocalization around violence. And for many of us in the women's movement, it's a moment of rise, it's a kind of a wry feeling. It's finally people are getting to see what we've been talking about all the time, which Professor Ijaz Ahmed and Professor Bagchi spoke about much more eloquently in the morning session, which is that this particular model of development that we are following, the neoliberal capitalist model of development, is inextricably linked with violence, and violence against women in particular. It is inextricably linked with communalism. It is linked with all of the earlier forms and axes of oppression that Professor Bagchi spoke about. As neoliberal capitalism has finds itself at home in this country, it is using all those traditional forms of exploitation that we are familiar with, whether it's caste-based, class-based, gender, feudalism, and so on. All of those are fully in play. They have not been displaced and they have not been rendered obsolete. We also, I mean, it seems very obvious to us that this entire state and corporate agony and angst around the public sort of exposure of violence against women, particularly in the media and in the foreign media, is so threatening because it is such a refutation of the whole idea of India that has been marketed globally. Whether through corporate channels, whether through platforms like the UN and various economic forums, whether through BRICS. I mean, this whole idea of India as a very, very different kind of emerging power. As Jyoti said, a place where capitalism has developed in its own way, a democracy that is committed to the ideals of non-violence, an old civilization, very high values with a very high kind of moral standard for public life, peace, respect for diversity, unity and difference and all of that. All of this composite picture of India that has been marketed rather ineffectively under the label of India Shining by the BJP, but very effectively by UPA 1 and UPA 2 in a far more sophisticated way. This whole construction is called into question by what is now being exposed every day and what we have experienced as individuals. I mean, this is the reality of our daily lives. This is the reality of our existence. So it seems now that there is no more need to continue to shout and scream and say that this particular construction of India is actually the result of a very conscious project of collaboration between the Indian state, the neoliberal Indian state, and various power holders within traditional hierarchies, power holders within caste hierarchies, within gender hierarchies, within various religious and communal hierarchies. There is a very, very beautiful marriage of interests between them. And this story of India as a great democracy, as different, as committed to human rights as well as to growth and to elimination of poverty. This is it's not a random act. It hasn't happened by the way. It's a very, very conscious project that furthers not only the interests of neoliberal state, but also the interests of feudalism and the interests of class and the interests of the exploitative power holders within society with whom we are familiar. It's also a fact that the whole discourse of development and growth is actually framed very, very obviously in a way that makes violence a legitimate tool of governance and a legitimate sort of side business of development. We have learned to take it for granted that if we want growth, if we want development, a few people are going to be hurt. A few people will shout about being displaced. A few people will ask for compensation, which the rest of us feel is not legitimate. And that happens. That is collateral damage, and the great juggernaut of development has to go on despite that. The statistics are very, very frightening. According to estimates compiled from government documents and data, around 60 million people have been displaced just in the last decade. Between 2000 and 2010, 60 million people have been displaced as a result of development projects, many of them of very dubious value. By the time the project becomes a reality on the ground, everybody has forgotten about it and moved on somewhere else. So an analysis of what benefits that project has delivered to how many people never takes place. What also does not take place is how many women, particularly women belonging to Dalit communities, Adivasis, landless and migrant workers, informal sector workers, urban communities and so on, whom Jyoti and Smita spoke about. What has happened to them as a result of this development? And the consequence of this silence is that we continue to see violence against communities and particularly against women as a collateral of development rather than as the engine of that development. And I think, I just want to underline the whole Salwa Judum story, which everybody knows about. But I think the Salwa Judum story is the one which most clearly shows how neoliberal capitalist interests, caste interests, and mainstream right-wing Hinduism have all been served by arming Adivasi youth to forcibly remove communities from their traditional areas, which are now the target of mining companies and of industries, and to push them into camps to adopt a kind of a scorched earth kind of a policy, to burn homes, to burn entire villages so that nobody can come back there. There is now plenty of documentary evidence to show the money trail from companies such as Tata and Jindal's straight to the ground level coordinators of Salwa Judum, who are not surprisingly the old mafia of forest contractors and petty forest officials, state officials and so on. 600 villages is the government figure that of people who have been destroyed, and we know that large-scale violence against women, gang rape, sexual mutilation, sexual assault, illegal confinement, disappearance of women in huge numbers has been the tool with which Salwa Judum has ensured not only that people leave their villages but that they never come back. It is the threat of violence against women which has crushed the resistance of Adivasis there. Now, this group, it would be redundant really to point out the kind of collusion between the Congress-led government at the center and the BJP-led government at the state that allows women like Soni Sori to remain in prison without bail on extremely flimsy charges. One after the other, those charges are being thrown out, but women like her, many Adivasi women like her, come out freed from one charge and are immediately arrested on another charge. They are subjected to the most gross, brutal sexual violations while in jail. Institutions like the NHRC and the NCW throw up their hands. They conduct on-the-spot investigations and come away saying, oh, they seem fine, and maybe there have been some malpractices which the state government needs to sort out. So the fact that closing their eyes to violence against women, which is ultimately in the interests of companies who are very close to the central government as well as to the state government, I think this is now so obvious that it's going to be very difficult to make a case to cover this up. What is also interesting is the way in which the Hindu right wing and the RSS are involved in Salwa Judum. There is a huge movement of so-called reconversion of Adivasis into the Hindu fold, which is happening in parallel to and in collaboration with Salwa Judum, which is also focused entirely on the sexuality of women. I mean, traditionally, Adivasis have not seen themselves as part of the Hindu community. They are a distinct community with their own distinct practices, but the whole labeling of Adivasis as Vanvasis, this whole religious construction of how the Adivasi community is located with respect to the privileged castes and classes is going on as a kind of a large official discourse, and we see the government implicated in these actions of destroying Adivasi culture and destroying Adivasi identity by reabsorbing them into Hinduism. And of course, the retribution for not returning to the Hindu fold is also exacted on the bodies of women. I don't need to point out the number of Adivasi Christian nuns who have been raped in Orissa and in Chhattisgarh, in Jharkhand. And I also don't need to once again quote our former Home Minister and his remark that this is legitimate Hindu revenge for forcible conversion of Adivasis to Christianity in the past. Again, speaking about caste, I think we need now to start questioning this construction again by the Hindu right of caste as a kind of fundamental organizing principle of Hindu society. There is enough work, and there are many powerful voices who say that we need to look at the role of the colonial state in codifying and in freezing castes and in creating the kind of privileging of certain castes that we see now. We know that caste hierarchies were very significantly used during the during the struggle for independence as also. And we also know that today caste has crystallized into perhaps the most powerful marker of poverty, of exclusion, of domination, of oppression, discrimination, all of that. So we do need to look at caste differently, as so many movements for equality, particularly in Andhra Pradesh, are doing on the ground. And I wanted to also point out that the so-called developed, fast developing areas of the country like Haryana and Noida surrounding Delhi where I live, where the development is completely focused on converting agricultural land not only into industrial land but also into housing. and housing as a major form, has emerged as a major form of investment, that whole nexus of the land mafia and the caste mafia. I think we should recognize that platforms like the CAP, which claim the right to decide, to take judicial decisions on the lives of women, particularly women of the oppressed castes, within their area of influence. It's worth noting that despite all the noise made in the Lok Sabha and in Parliament after several brutal CAP murders, the amendment proposed by the Home Ministry to the law in order to include CAP murder and honor killing as a specific form of murder has still not been passed, and that there are powerful politicians belonging to these communities across political parties who continue to oppose it. We all know that our icons of modern corporate political activism like Naveen Jindal have argued very strongly for CAPs to be legitimized and to be recognized as family courts. So I think these are entry points for us to start thinking about the kind of corporate modernity that survives on a particular construction of Hindu national identity. Dr. Professor Ejaz Ahmed already pointed out that Hindu nationalism, perhaps because of Hindus being a majority community, maybe the state by default becomes Hindu. But I would also like to point out that Nanda has done a lot of very good detective work on the ground. She has uninvisibilized, traced really the links between the state, corporates and Hinduism in India. We know that middle class Indians are becoming more actively religious. As they become more prosperous, they are becoming more actively religious. We know that the state, which is supposed to be socialist and secular, is complicit in this process of promoting Hindu religious revival, whether it is promoting religious tourism, whether it is providing state support and encouragement to various gurus, whether it is supporting private sector trusts which run institutions that impart value-based, in other words, Hindu value-based education, giving away land at highly subsidized rates to such institutions. There are many actions of the government which are very clearly directed towards promoting a Hindu ideal of Indianism and India and nationalism. As Professor Ejaz Ahmed said at the end of his lecture, it is a very macho, very masculinist vision of nationalism that is being promoted, a very militant and militaristic form of nationalism, not only by the Hindu right wing, but all other forms of communal right wing things. And we know that we have a long history of this construction of macho nationalism. I mean, historians here would know all the work that has been done during the independence movement and during the nationalist struggle, the whole construction of Bharat Mata and the way that nationalist leaders dealt with, on the one hand, the desire to counter the British labeling of them as effeminate, weak, Hindus as not strong enough to take on the British Empire, and on the other hand the counter desire to become modern, to adopt technology, to adopt the civilizing values of the British state and so on. One sees the same dynamics, whether it is the stormtroopers of Modi in Gujarat, whether it is the same stormtroopers in Orissa and in several other states, you see the same dynamic. Smita has already spoken about how economic policies and particularly the whole microcredit movement again constructs women and is the entire profit within that form of development is based on exploitation of women's unpaid labor, and there are also very material forms of violence and exploitation. But I just want to conclude by accepting that very often the feminist focus on violence against women as a key issue has been criticized, has been criticized by the left also. It's been criticized as being a very divisive and polarizing kind of an issue. It's been said that this weakens social movements, it makes them vulnerable, it's a kind of suicidal thing. I mean, I would like to put before this House the opposite view, that violence against women is important precisely because it politicizes spaces which seem neutral. It politicizes spaces which seem apolitical, which seem unconnected, which seem standalone and independent of each other. And it does this by exposing not only their hidden gender biases, but also their class biases, their caste biases, their religious biases. So I feel, and all of us in the women's movement feel, that action against violence can actually be the force that builds solidarity between different movements for democracy, movements against fundamentalism, movements for survival, can provide a unified political platform. Thank you.